Okay, this is the tutorial for lesson 4.3 Melonman. This can be found on my website, so if you go to any of my websites, I've got from any page within any of my sites. If you just click on my name, Mr. St.Romain, it'll bring you to this landing page, and we're going to be working from here, the grade 10 ComTech site. If you're having trouble with any of the downloads, you can actually get the downloads from the old ComTech site by going to Photoshop, scrolling down to the tutorial that we're talking about, and grabbing the documents here. I've got them here as well, but for what we'll be doing, they are here. I've got the downloads here, but some people have had trouble in the past downloading them. I may add somewhere to the site, I may add like a docket where you can just go and download all of my downloads. Maybe I'll do that this week. Anyways, for now, you should be able to download here. So you're going to need two things. One, the PSD, which I've got here, and the instructions, which I've also got here. Okay, the instructions are a PDF, and the PSD is obviously a PSD. Okay, so by clicking on this, it'll take you to this page here. And then you don't want to use this image, you actually want to use the download. So make sure you click this, download it. It's going to go into your downloads folder. So make sure that you either move it from here into your named last name, first name folder and put it in Photoshop, or alternatively, you can open it straight from your downloads like this by double clicking it. Just make sure that you then file save as and put it in the appropriate place in your documents, in your named folder, so that you're not saving things in your downloads folder, but rather in your named folder in an organized way. Okay, and name it Melonman or Mr. Melon, whatever, something like that, but not start 0.01. That doesn't make sense as a file name. Okay, so make sure you are organizing things as you should. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to go back to this Melonman. All right, this is our PSD, and looking at it, you'll see there are a number of elements, and where we're going to end up is here, okay, with all of these pieces. This is a selection tutorial, so you're going to be learning a number of ways to select elements on a file. This tutorial gets a little bit circular and repetitive. It goes over doing things a number of different ways, and so if you're following the instructions exactly as they are, it does get a little bit long-winded. You don't need to know 5 different ways of doing things, you only need to know one. I'll show you a couple of the ways I do things, but you don't necessarily have to know every single way to do things, and I find that even within this tutorial, I wouldn't do some of the things that are done this way. I'll show you how they're done so you can see them, but typically we're going to learn some better ways to make selections anyways. It is just a good idea to know how these tools work, because on occasion you will need to know how these things these operate. Okay? Right, so the first thing we're going to do is here, selecting with a rectangular marquee. If you're following with the tutorial, skip the getting started, because we just delete a bunch of preferences, which we don't need to worry about for this version of Photoshop. And we are going to start here, selecting with the rectangular. So I'm also going to be mentioning the keyboard shortcuts that you should be starting to familiarize yourself with. And so as we do this, you'll get hopefully better at using the keyboard shortcuts, because that's going to make it a little easier for you to, whoops, close these. You can modify and what's going on here? Something is acting weird. There we go. You can set your desktop up as you would like. I'm setting mine like this. I'll probably be using more than anything the history palette, so I'm going to open this up and the selection tools. But for this tutorial, I think I only need the history palette. So let's begin. So first, I'm going to actually minimize this so that I can work like this, and get this guy open here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is hit M on our keyboard. It's going to select the marquee tool. By default, mine was on the elliptical. I actually want to use the rectangular marquee tool. And all we're learning here is that I can draw a marquee around a selection. And what that means is I'm telling Photoshop that I care about what's inside of this selection. I don't care about what's outside of that. So if I went to perhaps, for example, move this, it's going to move the thing that was inside the selection, right? So notice a couple of things about this. When I put my cursor inside this selection here, it changes my cursor to this little arrow with a marquee. And what I can do then is move my marquee or my selection around. I'm not actually moving the image, I'm just moving where the selection is. If I'm outside of it, it changes back to this crosshairs, and what that does is I can either click to deselect my selection, or I can click and drag a new selection. So anytime I'm outside of my selection, I'm going to click and drag a new one. Anytime I'm inside of my selection, I'm going to move my existing selection. And that works with any of the selection tools. If I've got a selection tool selected, any of them, if I'm inside, I go to move it. I go outside, I'm going to reselect, okay, and redrag. Okay, so I'm going back to marquee. There's my selection tool. Okay, right. So that's our first thing that we're done, and we're done with that. We're actually not going to do anything else. So let's go down to the next little bit here. We're going to work on the blueberry. So let's zoom in. A couple ways to zoom in. First, I'm going to deselect this. So I'm going to go select, deselect, or I could just hit Command D on my keyboard, and that would deselect it as well. My selection is gone. I'm going to now zoom in, either using the zoom tool, and I can drag to zoom in, or I can go Command plus or Command minus to zoom in or out. Now, by default, your Photoshop has this grid. It's called the pixel grid. I personally don't like it, so I turn it off by going View, Show, Pixel Grid, and I uncheck that. Oops, Show Pixel Grid, and that turns off those little white lines. I don't like those, but you're welcome to leave it on if you prefer it. I don't. Right, I'm going to be selecting this circle of the blueberry, so I don't want a square, I want a elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to drag over top of this. Now purposely I'm off by a little bit, because what we want to learn here is that we can either select out of this and reselect it, or there's a couple things I can do. I can get a circle and then reposition this and hope to get the size right, which I did, but better than that, I can, while I'm dragging this, I'm going to do a couple things with my keyboard. I'm going to hold Shift, first of all, to constrain the proportions to make it a perfect circle. And while I'm holding Shift and my mouse button, because I'm still holding the mouse button to size this, I'm going to hold the space bar as well. And what that does is it moves my registration point, or my starting point. So you'll notice when I started clicking my circle, or my ellipse, I clicked up here and I dragged down, and it kind of goes down and to the right. And then I can hold Shift and space bar, and I can reassign both my size and my registration point to better select as much or as little of this blueberry that I want, and I'm happy with that. I'm purposely leaving a little bit outside of this selection so that I'm not picking up any of these kind of half blue pixels. I only want it to be the berry. Okay, now if you're unhappy with that, you can always reselect and select again. You don't have to make it a perfect circle. If you want, you can try and go for more of an oval. If you feel like that berry is not as circular as you might think it should be, you can reselect that as you need. Okay, great. Double click my magnifying glass, takes me back out to 100%. I'm going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing. And now remember, if I have a selection tool selected as my active tool, and I take this and I drag it, it's going to move the selection. That's not what I actually want to do here. Okay, so I'm going to undo that by going back to my history. I want to move this. So I'm going to go to the Move tool, V on my keyboard, or select the tool. And now when I drag, what's going to happen is it's going to change to a scissor or a cut tool. And that's going to drag what's in the selection to wherever I drag it, leaving, because I only have one layer, I only have one layer right now. Now in class, I've talked about layers. When we did Illustrator, we talked about cardboard cutouts or construction paper cutouts and things being layered. In Photoshop, I've talked a little bit about this being like a piece of paper, and any layer added on top of it is like a transparency, right? If I create a layer, it's going to create a transparent layer on top of it, and that's like one of those transparencies from like an overhead projector, right? Now, I don't need that, so I'm going to delete that. If I move something that's on this layer, it's not like a piece of paper where I cut it out and there's going to be a blank, like there's nothing here and I can see through it, because it's not paper, it's digital, it's a digital artboard. So what's going to happen, and to make this obvious, I'm going to make this a weird color, like purple. I'm setting my background color to purple. When I move this, it's going to leave the background color that I set. So if I make this another weird color, like green, it's going to leave whatever my background color is. Okay, so right now my background color is green. It leaves that green because there's nothing behind this layer to show through. So it has to leave something, so it leaves your background color. I'm going to set this back to black and white, okay, so that when I leave it, it leaves white. It doesn't really matter because we're going to get rid of it anyways, but for now, just so you know what's happening, that's what's happening. Great, I'm going to take this, I'm going to drag it, and I'm going to center it on my carrot here. I'm going to zoom in to this area, and I'm going to just reposition this until I'm happy with it. Now, I'm going to go back a step to before I deselected this. I could do this. There's actually, if you hit Command R on your keyboard, you can turn on and off these rulers. There's one on the top and one on the left. Command R will turn them on and off. And if I want to, I could take, by putting my cursor in the ruler and dragging down, I can create what's called a guide. And then I can use the edges of this circle here and where I think the center is to give me kind of a center point. Just to, I mean, I'm eyeballing it still, but this gives me kind of a better crosshair to work with. So now when I'm going to zoom out a little bit, when I drag this, I can actually drag it and sort of snap it into that center and feel like, yeah, that's pretty centered. You don't need to do that. I'm going to put these back by dragging them away with the Move tool selected. I'm going to drag these away and put them back. Okay, that gets rid of the guides. And you can do that, or you can use the arrow keys to fine-tune your positioning. Okay, and I'm going to leave it there. That looks fine to me. The other thing I want to note is that when I've got this selection marquee here and I move any of this around, while it's selected, it doesn't get rid of the pixels that are back here. But as soon as I deselect this, as soon as I go select, deselect, I can know those pixels that were here, the detail in the caret that's behind this, that's gone. I can't get it back because I've now overwritten those pixels on this one layer. Okay. Now typically I would have done this, if I was doing this anywhere but this tutorial, I would have made a new layer because I don't want to get rid of that detail. I may want to make a change later, and I can't make a change now. Say I decide, you know what, I want this to be a little further kind of up. I can't do that because I'm going to leave that white background here. This is a flat layer, right? And so by flattening them, by using this all as one layer and dropping this here, that sort of cements that decision. So I've got to be really careful that I'm happy with this. Okay, so just make sure before you deselect, before you get to this point, make sure you're happy with your, and of course you can go back in your history, right? You can go back in your history. As long as you haven't made too many moves in a row, I can go back and get this detail back. But once I deselect it and start making other moves, right? If I go select, deselect, and then do a bunch of other stuff, that'll be gone, okay? Now, that said, I've got something like 50 undo states here that I can go back. Right, I can keep moving back in my selection until I get back to here. But you'll be surprised how quick 50 steps disappears when you're working in Photoshop because you do a couple of brush strokes and you're at 50. All right, so moving along, we're pretty happy with that. We need to eventually we're going to move this over to our melon. So we need to select it. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to, instead of selecting like I did last time, what's my selection? Okay, so instead of selecting like I did last time, which was setting this up here and hoping to get the right setup, I'm actually going to start in the middle, and I'm going to hold Option. When I do that, instead of starting up here and dragging down and hoping to get it right, if I start in the middle and hold Option, it actually makes my circle from the registration point in the middle, and it goes out rather than down. Okay, see the difference there? Option gives me this, just regular clicking and dragging gives me this. So because it's a circle, I'm going to click in the middle here, Option. Okay, I'm going to go up to here, and I'm going to make it about a perfect circle, not quite. Looks like I'm a little too far to the right and down, so I'm going to hold Spacebar while I'm doing this, and then resize and reposition my circle or my ellipse until I'm happy with it. And that looks about right there. Happy with that selection. Zoom out, go to my Move tool, and zoom in one more step here. Okay, and with my Move tool, I'm going to go over it here and drag it into position on my melon. Great, everything looks pretty good so far. I need to make a duplicate of this. Now, notice that because I haven't deselected yet, all of the melon is still here. But as soon as I go to make a copy, and I'm going to make a copy by holding Option on my keyboard, which will give me this cursor. While I have the Move tool selected, I'm going to hit the Option key, and I'm going to drag to the right. But as soon as I do that, my selection is going to go with the thing I'm moving. And that's going to mean, as I make this selection, the original eye has blown out those pixels back there. Okay, those are gone. Okay, so this is still, I can still make some changes here, but I can't do anything here because I've obliterated those melon pixels that were back here. Okay, so just be careful that you're happy with the positioning of this thing, okay, before you start dragging your other one around. Now again, of course, you can always go back in your history and you can make changes you want. Just be aware that that will only happen for 50 moves in a row, and like I say, that will disappear quickly. All right, there's our Melonman, or the Melonman eyes. That looks pretty good. Let's move on with our tutorial. Scroll down a little bit here, and we've done all of this. Next, we're going to work on the mouth. So again, this is not doing anything different. There's nothing super difficult about this. I'm going to go to my oval tool, or my elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to make an oval. So again, I'm going to rough out the sizing, use spacebar to modify my registration point, and then move my marquee until I'm happy with it. Okay, I'm going to zoom out, Command minus will zoom out, and I'm going to position, oops, mistake there, V, I want my move tool, and I'm going to move that kiwi into position on my mouth. If you're zoomed in, imagine I'm at this point and I want to move. I don't want to change my tool. If you hit the space bar, you get this little hand tool, and it's a good way to move around when you're zoomed in without changing your tool or deselecting or anything like that. Okay, great. So we are happy with that. That looks pretty good. Note also that while I've got this selected, I can actually use the keys on my keyboard. So I'm using the arrow key to move up and down and left and right. And as I do that, I can fine-tune the position of my my melon. I can also hold Shift and move 10 pixels at a time. Okay, so Shift and arrow key will move this, as you see, around on my keyboard. Next, where are we at here? Scroll down. All right, I'm happy with this. I'm going to go select, deselect, or Command D to deselect my selection. Double click my zoom magnifying glass to get my full size, and then zoom in till I can see what I'm doing. Next, we're going to be doing this, it's called a pear tomato, and we need to get that over as the nose. So let's zoom in on this guy right here. We're going to be using the magnifying glass, the magic wand tool, which is hidden under the quick selection tool. So if you hit W on your keyboard, it'll select this tool, and then if you click and hold, you'll get the magic wand tool. These two are selected and they related, and they do similar things. I'll show you this one right now, and then you can probably figure out the quick selection tool. It does a very similar setup. All right, so by default, the tolerance on this tool is set to 32. Okay, and I'm going to click here on the darkest part of this pear, and you'll see it selects part of the pear. Now I'm going to click on a lighter part of the pear and see it selects a different part of the pear. Okay, and then when I select in the middle, it selects most of the pear. Now what's happening is it's selecting the closest 32 colors to the color I select. So when I click here, it's clicking the closest 32 to these dark colors. When I click here, it's clicking the closest 32 to this color where I clicked. I can change that by making that say 16, and now when I click, it's a smaller selection. If I make it 8, and I click, it's an even smaller selection. Okay, so if I click here, I'm just getting these 8 closest colors. If I click here, I'm getting these 8. And you can see that depending where I click and what my tolerance is, I can select more or less of this pear. Well, I may want to use a low number like this and add slowly. So as I'm clicking, if I hold Shift, it changes my tool to an additive selection tool, which means I can add to my selection. Now this is using a tolerance of 8 doesn't make a lot of sense because that's too limiting, but I just want to make the point that I can add to my selection by using this additive feature of holding Shift while I'm doing this. I can also hold Option and subtract. So I'm subtracting 8 pixels or 8 colors at a time from my selection, the closest 8. So anywhere I click, it'll deselect that. Now, what I should be doing is probably closer to like 64, because 32 is too low. And usually what we do is we double and half the number we're using to get more or less selection. So I'm going to select, deselect, and I'm going to click right in the center here, and it looks like I missed some of these lighter colors. So again, I'm going to select, deselect, and I'm going to go maybe here, and that does a pretty good job. It looks like I missed just a little bit there. So if I hold Shift and click in there, I've picked up all the rest of that. Okay, and depending on where you click, you might actually get it the first time, depending on where you click. You'll notice that I'm kind of missing bits of it. So hold Shift, pick up the rest. I'm going to zoom out, Command minus, and again, I want to position this, so I'm going to go to my Move tool, not my Selection tool. Oops, my Selection tool, it's just going to move the selection. I don't want that. I want the Move tool, and I'm going to drag this over. I'm using the space bar to give myself some positioning, and I'm going to place that where I need it. That looks good to me. Select, deselect. Good. Next, let's scroll down. Note that this looks different. So if you're following along in the tutorial, this is for an old version of Photoshop. So this actually looks quite different than it does in our current version of Photoshop. And so when you're doing this, just note that the tolerance is up here in this tool. Okay, great. Moving along. I'll scroll down here. I'm also going to take a sip of water because I am talking a lot here. Okay, moving along here. So the next thing we're doing is this selecting with the lasso tool. Now this is a little bit tricky because you have to do it in sort of the right order. There's a few keyboard shortcuts and mouse clicks you have to do in the right order for this to work. And they've purposely used this bow tie because it's got both smooth parts and jagged parts. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this tool, the lasso tool, okay, to select this deal. Let's take a look at what it does first. I'm going to go here. I'm going to just make a random shape, and then when I make that selection, it closes off that selection, and then when I move it, it moves the part that I've selected. I can probably do a decent job here of like trying to follow this and then going like this, but it's not a great job by any means. Okay, so we're going to find a better way. This, on the other hand, is a polygonal lasso tool. So now what will happen is I can do straight lines. And so what you see is it's creating these like polygons based on where I click. And depending on what I do and what I include in my selection, when I go to my move tool, it's going to pick up that polygon and move it around. Okay? Command Z, undo, select, deselect. I'm going to go to this lasso tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the lasso tool, which gives me these organic shapes like this, okay, to follow this curve. And then mid-selection, while I'm doing this, I'm going to hit the Option key, and that's going to change it to this second tool, the polygonal lasso tool. So watch. This is going to take you a few tries, and I mess it up still, and I've done this like 50 times, and I still mess it up sometimes, but hopefully I'll get it right. I'm clicking my mouse, and I'm dragging along, and this is going to take you guys a couple tries because it's not necessarily easy. Oops, see, told you I'd mess it up. Let me try that again. I'm going to click and drag along here, and you guys might mess it up as well, which is not the end of the world. I'm going to go all the way over here. Okay, so here's where it gets a little bit tricky. I'm still holding my mouse, and I need to click the Option key on my keyboard and let go with my mouse. And what happens is it switches over to that other tool. So right now, I'm holding Option, and I'm not holding my mouse button down. Okay, Option key on the keyboard, no mouse button. When I click with my mouse button, it's going to set these polygonal straight lines, and that's going to give me that jagged edge that I want for this bow tie macaroni. Here's where it's going to get tricky. I need to click and let go with click with my mouse button and then let go with my Option key. So when I get to the end here, I click with my mouse, hold the mouse button down, and let go with my Option key and start drawing, and notice it goes back to the original lasso tool. Okay, and now again you've got to do this kind of carefully. It's not super difficult, but certainly it's easy to make a mistake on. And again, when I get to this point, I want to hold Option with my keyboard, let go with my mouse, and then click, 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 click until I'm done. Okay, when I get to the end here, I'm just going to click and let go of everything, and it finishes my selection. Okay, now again, this is not how I would necessarily do this. There are other easier ways to do this, but it is the way that the tutorial shows us, and it is good to know how these tools work. All right, I want to move this bow tie, so I go to my move tool and I drag this guy over, spacebar to move over, set him up in selection here. Now he's got a selection around him, so if you look at this guy, I go up here, you'll notice that that bow tie has been a bit squished right in the horizontal axis. So I'm going to go back over here, and while I've got this selection made, I can go Edit, Transform, Scale. Okay, the easier way to do this is actually even just click on this Show Transform Controls. I like this off because I find it distracting when I'm working, but if I'm doing a quick transform, I can turn it on and just drag this, okay, and that will kind of squish the horizontal axis, or I guess the vertical axis. Okay, when I'm happy with that, I just click this little checkbox or check mark here that applies that transformation. I'm going to turn this off because I don't like it, and then I'm going to reposition it so I'm not showing that bottom curve, so that I'm happy with that. Once I'm done with that, select, deselect, and I'm done. Moving on. Let me go down over here and bring this guy back to where we should be, which is here. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too difficult. If you did mess it up a couple times, of course you can stop the video and retry it a few times. Just remember it's about like getting the timing right. So go back, watch the video, and do it in the same kind of timing that I did. All right, next, mushroom. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go to my hand tool, which is here, and I'm going to hand tool over. I need this this mushroom cap here. So I'm going to go to my lasso tool, and I'm purposely going to, what they do is you'll notice that they miss part of, they purposely are off. So I'm going to sort of go a bit too far to the right here. I'm going to miss the stem, and I'm going to go over to here and close off my mushroom. Now that is not a very good selection, so I want to change it. I'm going to hold Shift on my keyboard, and what you'll see is I can now add to my selection by following a bit more closely that selection, and you can see that now adds to my selection. Looks like I kind of got a little messy in here, so I'm going to add that to my selection. I'm going to zoom in, Command plus, because it'll make it a little easier for me to kind of get the detail that I want. Hold Shift and add in all the detail that I want, and add this. And I want to get rid of this, so I'm going to hold Option, and I'm going to just kind of drag this through here, cutting off the pieces I don't want until I'm happy with my selection. Again, this is not the way I would do this in reality, but it is a valuable tool to know. Happy with that? Move tool, move our mushroom cap into position. I'm going to zoom in just to make sure that that's where I want it. And it's not. I'm going to put it right there. Select, deselect. Good, looking pretty good so far. Let's go down here. Oops. Okay, and there's a few keyboard shortcuts they show you, but we don't need to know every keyboard shortcut. We're doing okay. All right, Command 0 will fit the whole thing on my screen. And we have our next option is, or next thing we're going to do is the grapefruit. We're going to be using this grapefruit to create the ears, and you'll notice that what they do is they are only using the actual fruit. They're not using the rind, so we need to separate that. We're going to learn something called the magnetic lasso tool, and what that does is it will find high contrast areas, the difference between high contrast areas. And so if I click here and drag along the edge, it's gonna, I'm not actually telling it where to go. It's doing a pretty decent job. It'll do a kind of a not so good job here, but along high contrast areas, it'll do an okay job of rough selecting. And if you move too quickly, it'll do a bad job. If you move too slowly, sometimes it'll not do a great job either. So it's kind of a fine balance between moving quickly enough and slowly enough to get a good accurate magnetic lasso tool. If you're not happy with it, of course you can restart. And again, I don't love this tool, so I don't use it very often. But knowing that it's there, sometimes it might be useful, and then I can potentially go in and clean up my selection. We're going to do that for this thing here, so I'm going to go select, deselect, and I'm going to follow along here with that magnetic lasso tool, and I'm just going to go along this high contrast area here. Okay, I'm going to click on the corner here, follow straight along here, click to finish, and there's my selection. Okay, again, I don't want to move the selection, I want to move the actual physical image, so I go to my move tool, and I'm going to drag this guy over to kind of where the position is. I got to rotate it still, but that's where I want it. Now, just note that I would not also be doing this on one layer. If I open up my layers palette, you'll see we've only got one layer. I would never do it this way, because this is the whole reason we are having trouble with some parts of this, is because if I deselect this, I lose the graphics back there. I lose those pixels because they get obliterated. I would never do it this way. I would have everything on separate layers, and after this tutorial, so will you. Just recognize that for this tutorial, they don't want you doing that, and so for now, we're working on one layer, but that is not a particularly good workflow. Okay? All right, let's move this into position. I'm going to go edit, transform, rotate, and I'm just going to rotate this to like 90 degrees. If I hold shift, it'll snap to a 90. Okay, so while I'm rotating, I have like a percent, like a decimal point here, like 59 or 57.9 or whatever. If I hold shift, it'll snap to 60, 45, 30, 15. It'll give me like even angles. Okay, once I'm happy with that rotation, I'm going to hit the checkbox here, and then I'm going to position it roughly where I want it. I'm actually going to zoom in and I'm going to clean this up. I don't want this to be so straight. So I'm going to go to my Lasso tool and I'm going to hold Option. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just approximate the curve that melon takes. Now, it doesn't have to be exact. I'm just going to get rid of some of it just to give it that roundness. Okay, and that's not, there's no right or wrong way to do that. I just kind of got rid of part of it. Okay, good. Command minus to zoom out a little bit. Spacebar to move over. Move tool, or V on my keyboard. I'm going to hold Option on my keyboard and drag this way to make a duplicate. These pixels are blown out, so make sure that you're happy with the positioning because you can't go back unless you go in your history tool. And I'm going to take this guy and I got to flip him. A couple ways to do that. You can just go to Selection tool here and flip it like that. Or better than that, I'm going to undo that, is I'm going to go Edit, Transform, and I'm going to go Flip Horizontal. That's going to flip it on the horizontal axis, so it'll just flip it right over. Okay. Position it where I want it. Hit the check mark. I'm going to turn these off because I don't like them, and that part's done as well. Select, deselect. Okay, moving along. The last thing we need to do is this eyebrow kind of situation with these, I guess they're radishes or beets or whatever they are. I'm going to take and again, there's lots of ways to do this, but I'm going to take a rectangular marquee and select around those radishes. And because everything else in this is white, it's really easy to go Magic Wand tool, okay? And if I hold Option, it's going to give me that subtractive selection tool. So I'm going to click here, and it's going to subtract all the white pixels, the closest 64 colors. Now maybe I don't need it to be that high. Maybe I need it to be like 8. And I go Option, I click here, it's going to select only the white. If I had, notice when I had it up at 64, it cut further into, see how it kind of went further in because the closest 64 colors includes those edges, right? See how those have like a little bit of white in them, okay? If I undo that and drag this down to 8, it's going to pick up less of those white, okay? It gives me kind of a better selection there. That looks good to me. Command plus plus plus. Move tool, drag this guy into position, and I did a pretty good job of selecting there. I can't tell if I picked up any white, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to go View, Show, and I'm going to turn off Selection Edges. And that'll just tell me, look, actually you can see that I should have maybe done a bit more. See that? I don't want those white pixels. So I'm going to zoom back out again, and in fact I'm going to go back in my history to the point where I still have this. Okay, I'm going to turn them on to see them. View, Show, Selection Edges. Okay, I'm back to the point where I was here, and I'm going to go to this Magic Wand tool, and instead of 8, I'm going to go, let's try 32. Option, and that cuts in just a little bit there. That's going to be maybe better because I don't want any of those like half white pixels because they look messy. Okay, I'm going to zoom out, take this guy, drag it into position, zoom in down here. Okay, put it in position here. Okay, and I'm going to go View, Show, turn off that Selection Edges. That looks better. Okay, and I could possibly go a little bit further in, but I think that's okay. Now notice I haven't deselected. I've turned off those marching ants, the ones that are going around. They're still here. If I go View, Show, Selection Edges, they're still there. I just turned off the view for them. So they're still, everything is still selected, and I haven't gotten rid of those pixels underneath here. Okay, so be aware of that. The last thing I'm going to do once I've positioned this where I'm happy with it is I'm going to go Option on my keyboard while my Move tool is selected, V on my keyboard, Option on my keyboard, drag this over until it's over here on this side, okay, and I'm going to go again, Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, okay, there's my eyebrow, put it there, select, deselect, zoom out. That looks pretty good. Okay, I've got all the pieces I need. I'm going to zoom in and reposition, hit C on my keyboard or the crop tool, and what you'll see is you get this like handle, these handles over here, okay? If you're not careful, you could do this and accidentally end up over here. Just hit Escape on your keyboard. No, that doesn't work. Cancel that. I'm going to, here, I'm going to cancel this by going Don't Crop This, and it'll set it back to where you were. You may have to zoom out to see the entire scene, and then I'm just going to pick this up and drag it in until I'm happy with the sizing, and maybe I'm going to bring this guy up as well. When I'm done, I can either double click in an area or just hit the checkbox and now I've cropped my, now make sure you change this tool, because as soon as you do this again, it's going to crop this as well. So I got to undo this and change to my move tool, and I'm done. Once you're done with it, you're going to File, Save As, and save it as a Photoshop document in your named folder in your Photoshop unit. For your website, you're going to also make another copy, so save it again, save as a JPEG, and that's going on your website. You can name them the same thing as long as you have the JPEG and the PSD, okay, and then you are done. Save that, make your quality 9 or 10 or something like that, hit OK, and you've got a JPEG to put on your website. Excellent. If any of that was confusing, come and see Mr. St.Romain, or alternatively, just go back and rewatch the video, pause it where you need to, and hopefully that was easy enough to follow. Great. See ya.